Before I started my YouTube channel and was more of a viewer, I immediately became interested in what was going on out there in the world of goth on YouTube. And I began researching, and upon doing so, I was genuinely confused because what I found were a lot of goth YouTubers, and I'm using finger quotes because they're not actual goths, and I'm not really trying to say that to be mean, honestly, but there were people, not all of them, but the ones who were really dominating the search were people who didn't like goth music, did identify with the subculture, but didn't look in any way goth. For example, they looked like Rainbow Bright, they hated the music, they didn't really partake in anything in any way related to the subculture at all, yet they were identifying as such, and using the word in their titles, using the words in their description, and really going for the word goth. Like, for example, goth tries new candy, goth to something transformation. It was really a lot to take in. And I'm saying this coming from a perspective where I had taken a very long hiatus from the scene altogether. And it was due to a soul-destroying relationship, going through immigration, getting into the UK, and I had taken a big break from pretty much everything. And that's something I do plan on getting into because that's a story in itself, I'll tell you. But when I sort of came back into things, and this is very recently, it was like going into a coma in 2005 and then waking up in the middle of the Killstar Hall. You could never compare the goth scene circa 1986 to 1996. That would be ridiculous because in 10 years, the scene's going to evolve, things are going to change. So it would be really naive of me to think in nearly 20 years' time that things wouldn't even be more different. But this was a different. On this venue, it was like people had forgotten what goth was. And it was like someone had come along and said, I have just listened to the Queen of the Damn soundtrack last Tuesday, therefore I am the gothiest of goth things that will ever walk this earth, and I will take my platform on social media to inform the world on what it means to be goth, and anybody that opposes me in any way is an elitist. That is like a guy wearing a PETA t-shirt, eating a ham sandwich, vlogging from the circus about what animal rights means to him. When people come along and they bastardize goth, and then they place themselves up on a social platform and misrepresent it just because they like the way that it looks, with zero inclination to learn anything about it, it's insulting to the rest of us. It can't evolve or endure that way if that mentality is perpetuated. There's no future for it. People can be what they want to be. That is the beauty of free will. If they want to identify as a shoe, so what? So long as they're happy and they're not hurting anybody. Goth has evolved, things change. How many times have you heard the evolution argument when people aren't getting their way? Yes, they're right on both counts. Things do evolve, things change, and they have. However, not in the way that they are purporting they have.
Beef log, what a treat! A hefty hunk of processed meat.
And that is why we care. So when I was first introduced to the alternative sort of lifestyle, whether you were goth, you were grunge, you were punk, you were raver, or just your standard alternative, across the boards, it didn't matter. Being called a poser, that was the kiss of death. I was terrified of being called a poser, and as it turns out, I was actually branded a poser in high school by the grunge crew. And this was during a period when I was transitioning out of being a norm or normie and into what we referred to as a freak or an alternatine. And I've said it a few times that if you didn't come established and they see the transition taking place in high school, you're automatically a poser. But this was really the only time I was ever really referred to as such. In the 90s, being a baby bat, the word poser was feared. And the word elitist, it didn't exist. It just wasn't a word in our vernacular. It was just too dramatic. The word was too dramatic for goths. Think about that. If someone behaved as though they felt that they were better than you, we just chalked them up to being pretentious and then went about our day. I remember this one guy who was such a douche. He would get a hold of all of this really obscure music, band t-shirts, and we knew never to ask him because we knew what the response would be. And if anybody ever did dare ask him where he got it, he'd be like, ugh, I don't reveal my sources. And that was such a dicky thing to do. But that's what makes me so WTF about why people get so keyed up and throw around the word elitist when somebody tries to help you with music or they try to educate you, because the whole point of what you would call an elitist is to keep you down. They don't want to educate you, because to educate you is to give you power, and by giving you any sort of knowledge, that puts you on an even playing field, and that's not what the elitist wants. Back in the 90s, goths were really in the spotlight because the media really wanted to put a negative spin on it. We were murderers, we were devil worshippers, we were coming for your children. Whenever something hit the news that brought negative attention to the goth scene, the news outlets were out in droves, and they were seeking out the only people that would give them the shock value that they wanted. They went straight for the people that drew pentagrams on their foreheads, wore trench coats after Columbine, dog collars with a leash, and they stuck their tongues out and growled and barked into the camera while somebody acting equally as ridiculous held onto the leash. And the thing is, when they spoke for all of us because they identified as goths. Obviously, this all reflected poorly upon us because this painted a negative and very untrue picture of what we really were all about. I remember the spectacle outside the clubs the weekend following the Columbine shootings, and it was just tons of news media outlets looking to get shots of goths going in and out of the clubs and hoping to actually get a chance to speak with us. And we kind of made it a point, some of us made it a point to just ignore them altogether, and then some tried to speak to them and do it in a very respectful, succinct manner to where they didn't portray us as jerks. However, this isn't what they wanted. And I remember one Saturday night outside the bank, this was a club that we went to in the city, there was this one dude wearing a long black trench coat. I can't remember verbatim what the jacket said, but I remember the gist of it. So he had this long black trench coat on, and sort of painted on in white, it said something like, X amount of jocks killed, X amount to go, something, 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 progress. Out of everybody in that club, who do you think is the first person that spoke to the cameras? I hated the fact that the word poser even existed because it had me on constant edge. I loved the goth scene, and as a baby bat, I was in love and intrigued, and I respected it in every aspect that I possibly could, but in my mind, being a poser meant instant death. But I didn't get it yet. This wasn't high school. Granted, at the end of the weekend, I would return to school, and I went back to a place where reputations stuck. You had the word poser thrown your way, and that was basically it. That's what you were branded for the rest of the year. But it wasn't like that in the goth scene, because that word, it sort of hung around in the air like the wooden spoon Italian grandmas had. They would threaten to spank you in the ass with it should you misbehave, but they never actually used it. But you knew it was there, and you sort of feared it. And that wooden spoon, just the knowledge of it, kept you from misbehaving. Later on, I really started to realize the importance of the seemingly malicious word. It wasn't actually this big bad thing, and it took the experience with these news crews and everything for me to put it all together and really get it. Poser was rarely heard, but when it was used, it was really deserved, and when it was used, it really did weed out the people who weren't genuine and were disrespectful, and they just really wanted attention bad. It was reserved for the people who were deliberately trying to vandalize the bathrooms, or screaming really loud over songs, or starting a mosh pit during Sisters of Mercy where you'd take a surprise elbow to the face. True story. They were dropping their drinks all over the floor, barking at people, but going on talk shows and calling themselves goths. But that one word, poser, that one word eventually got them to move along, and also didn't help that they would get banned from the clubs from starting fights, but that word over time has really, it's disappeared. Now these people are back, but in a different way, but I immediately recognized them. I became much more aware when I became involved in the subculture on social media, because that's kind of where they exist now. Before the word elitist came to be, the subculture was about the people, about the experiences, about the music that you didn't just hear, you felt. The films, the literature, the clothing, and random little bits and pieces you put together that spoke to who you were as a person. The aesthetic, which was beautiful and dark, taking cues from the past in art and architecture. And this was all reflected in the way that people conducted themselves. It was all about creativity, whether it was DIYing your own clothes, drawing, painting, sketching, sculpting, writing, whether it was poetry, writing stories, it didn't matter. It was inspiring because that's what the scene really was all about. It just inspired you. Today, you're only as goth as the kill star on your back. Now, how is that fair? What if you can't afford it? Does that mean that you're not who your heart tells you you are, simply because you don't have the right clothing? Okay, big deal. So person A can replicate the best Susie Sue makeup, but is this person going to go to a cemetery with you and lie under the stars and talk about anything and everything? Or are they going to be taking selfies the whole time and trying to vlog it? The only difference between this new incarnation of people and the ones I spoke of 20 years ago is technology. And of course, everything that comes along with it. They're still misrepresenting us to the public and anyone else showing interest in the subculture. They're still combative, disrespectful as hell, still attention-seeking, still know nothing nor care to know anything about the subculture at all. They just come in much prettier packaging, which makes them more appealing. It gives them an ego that they use to judge everyone that can't afford punk rave or has a job and can't shave the sides of their head. I feel awful when I see this because it really truly affects them. I get comments like crazy from so many people wanting to come out as goth, but they're afraid of being judged by the so-called fashion brigade and deemed not goth worthy. I blame the degeneration of the word poser. Back in the day, that is a word that kept people in line. All across subcultures, from raver to punk, poser was the kiss of death. It was discrediting, it nullified, it was the scarlet letter of phony that kept a person from making a spectacle of themselves in a way that was damaging to the subculture by depicting goths in an unfavorable light. Now, not everyone was called a poser. In fact, once I became a goth, I rarely heard it be used, but it was just the fear of such that kept us all from signing up to be on the Maury Povich show. Today, there's a new word which has resurrected the human wrecking ball to the subculture. That word elitist is locked and loaded due to every appropriator, weekender, crybaby, spoiled brat snowflake. Like a petulant teenager threatening to call Child Protective Services on their parents for taking away their phone. And what happens after that? The parent concedes, and the child is free to misbehave. The word elitist is like the new haterade, and I think we need to resurrect the wooden spoon so the rest of you can finally come out of your coffins in peace.